Hello viewers, welcome to the Lungleng Show. Today we'll talk about something that is really interesting in a way, more academic at the same time, that academic studies that have lots of significance in our life, especially in the context and the life of the Nagas. We don't know a lot of things about our past or the kind of the people we were and we are and from where we came from and what are the tests of our past saying or indicating that where we come from. So we don't know a lot of things about what kind of life that our our ancestors used to live, and those are the things that we're not able to read. We don't have the document to really refer nowadays. But I think here is a very interesting person by the name Dr. Diadoshi Jamir, and he has been doing wonderful and interesting works on the life in the field of archaeology. And he has a lot of works related to the life of the Nagas, and he has also focused a lot of his research and excavations on the life and history of the Nagas as well. I think this really caught my attention, and I think this will be very interesting because in our normal day-to-day conversation and public discourse, we hardly come across and learn this kind of knowledge. And I think having him today on our show is quite special in a sense that we will be able to observe and understand and listen to him from the point of his, studies and excavations that he has done, and from the points of research studies that he has been doing even today. I think for almost 3 decades that he has been in teaching. At the same time, he has been doing his works on excavation, on the life of the people which is ourselves. And I'm sure this will be really interesting. So and Dr. Diadoshi Jamir is currently teaching in Naga University as a professor in the Department of History and Archaeology. And he was also the former head of department for this history and archaeology. And he has done his PhD, more than 2 decades ago. And he has been in this archaeological field for so long. I think we are going to learn a lot from his experience and from his research and studies done along this, more than 2 decades. I think this is a rare opportunity that we get. So thank you so much, Doctor, for coming on our show and to have this conversation with you.
Thank you for having me, and it's my great pleasure.
Thank you. I think it's been wonderful going through your CV and your profile and the kind of works that you have been doing. And it looks like you have dedicated your life into, archaeological works and studies. And that revolves around not necessarily international studies. You have done some part of it, but a lot of your works also revolve around the studies that you have done on Naga people. So this has been really interesting. But before we jump into how this, the details of the studies that you have done on the Naga people and the lives of the Naga people, I think I would like to first understand how archaeological survey is normally carried out and how the excavation process is normally done.
Okay. The surveys that we undertake is quite different from the mainstream. Mm-hmm. From the mainstream in the sense that we have archaeological sites that are right up the mountains. Mm. And the reason why I say mainstream is because in mainland area where I was, studying back in the day, and we had this kind of training where for you to identify a site would be a habitation mound, right? A huge mound, an artificial mound, which was quite easy for us to identify it.
Right.
But in upland archaeology, this is very different. The methodology is different. And through experience, I didn't learn this from my MA, days or during my PhD when I was trained in Deccan College. By the way, I did my PhD in Deccan College and also my master's in Deccan College.
In Pune. Right? Yeah.
Yes. So the kind of archaeological training that we had there, apart from theoretical archaeology, the field archaeological training that we had there was very much mainland-centric based,
Yep.
where topography is different, and also the settings of the sites are different.
Yep.
Chronology-wise, they're different. So, for us, here in Northeast India particularly, and also here in Nagaland, what we do is we often rely on our oral tradition. That is, if we are to look at our ancestral sites, for instance, the Naga ancestral sites. But again, we have another category of sites which are much, much older. Let's say the prehistoric cave sites. That is different. That, since we do not have an oral tradition associated with those cave sites, what we do is we go from river to river looking for caves and rock shelters. And that's how we identify it. But for our ancestral sites, for Naga ancestral sites, I think the central lead that can give us a clue is the oral tradition. And I think this oral tradition is really important for us to be able to identify our ancestral sites. So once we approach the village, saying that we would want to look at your ancestral sites, they come to our rescue. They say, okay, we are willing to support, and we can take you around the landscape where we have stories, where we have oral accounts of our ancestors inhabiting this parts of the landscape, that part of the landscape. So that's how we identify our.
But is there a close link between our oral documentation or oral stories and the actual excavation stories when you find it? Is there a connection, or oral is just oral?
There is. And you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised by this. This also goes on to say how reliable is oral history.
Whoa.
Yes. This is really something which was least expected, but from our experience of all these years of field work and doing field archaeology, we realized that there's something in our oral history that is not just, a figment of our imagination.
Right.
There is some tangible evidence that suggests that our ancestors were there.
No, that's it. I mean, that's very comforting.
It's really fascinating.
Fascinating is something.
Yeah.
Would you have any example, like from your experience?
Well, the most vivid example that I can give you is this site of Chungli Imti.
Okay.
Where, Aos have this oral tradition of our origin and migration from this particular village.
All the Aos?
Yes, but not only the Aos. Not only the Aos. I think in former times, let's say in pre-colonial times,
right,
this particular site was also associated with a section of the Poms, with a section of the Konyaks, with a section of the Changs. Wow. So this site was a really important site, and not only us, the locals could identify this site based on the oral history. And very close by, in and around the proximity of the site, we have the stone monuments, which is popularly known as Longtrok. And the Aos and Sanctums and Poms and section of Konyaks, we have this belief that our ancestors emerged from these stones. That's the origin myth, right? So when we excavated very close by the proximity of these stones, we found traces of human settlements.
I see.
There were post holes emerging, and there were a lot of pottery assemblage coming up from the excavations, stone tools, iron tools, beads, and rice husk, charred rice husk. We had millet. So it did open up, a lot of our understanding of the site as a result of this excavation. But the central role that played here was the oral history.
Right.
Yes.
Based on that, you started exploring that area.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting. So, I mean, rice husk, I mean, still there. So how many years, that was not in the recent past, right? You know, those Zhongli Imti story in oral, that's not in the recent past. So roughly how many years can we date back those stories, for example, those when you found those implements and so on?
Right. We have around 8 to 9 radiocarbon dates
Okay.
for this particular site. And it goes back, I mean, we have a very broad range
Right.
of the age
Correct.
for this particular site. And it goes back to as early as 8th century AD.
Whoa.
8th century AD, yes. And it goes back as recent as the 17th century AD. And if you look at the oral history, there seems to have been some episode of people abandoning the settlements, they're leaving, another group coming, they're staying for a while, or perhaps it's not the whole group leaving the site, right?
Yeah.
Or it's just some few households or some clan members leaving the site. And so it went on for few centuries. So the occupation history of the site extends from as early as 8th century to as recent as the 17th century. So it's a very broad chronological framework.
Correct. Wow, those are really very fascinating
Yes.
in its own way.
Yes. So through this work, I mean, it gave us the understanding of how important is our oral history when it comes to archaeology as well. So oral history is not only important for the anthropologists
Right.
or the historians or the other disciplines, but it's equally important for archaeology.
Right. Is archaeology part of a scientific studies? Can we consider that?
Yes,
Okay.
it is a scientific study, but at the same time, since it is a multidisciplinary subject, right? It embraces inspirations from the humanities also,
Yeah.
the social sciences,
Right.
and also the natural sciences and the life sciences. So
Yeah.
it is a
I
multidisciplinary
can see that.
subject.
Yes. Now you mentioned about Zhongli Imti.
Right.
There is something called Makel also.
Right.
Where it's considered the Nyeme group, where
Yes,
they disperse from that area somewhere
Right.
in Senapati district, not far from here.
Yes.
I mean, it's the same thing as the Zhongli Imdi that you mentioned, right?
Yes.
So can that also be substantiated in the way that you did, or what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, but there in the case of Makel or Makel,
Makel, yeah.
yes, the oral tradition is not so explicit about people living there. It goes on to say that they have rested for a while.
Acha.
Whereas in the case of Zhongli Imti, the oral tradition is very clear that people have lived there and that gave rise to our social institutions,
Okay.
right? So it was very clear there. But in the case of Makel, the oral accounts are not so explicit and clear about for how long did they live there, right? So perhaps they might have lived there for hundreds of years. We don't know. But the only tangible trace that we have is the tree.
Yeah.
Is the tree, right? And within that proximity, I'm not sure whether there has been earlier traces of settlements.
Correct.
Because it appears, I was there just some few months.
Acha.
I was there. It appears that the site is greatly disturbed. If there were some occupational deposits or traces of some human settlements there, it might have already got disturbed or destroyed.
Correct. Yeah.
So, yes. So, but like I said, it's not very clear there. Yes. So people refer to the story of Makel as, just a stopping point
Oh.
for some time, and then they disperse into various directions.
Okay.
Yes.
Wow. But do you think if we do a further excavation and studies on that, like you said, it seems to have been very disturbed from the original state of the area,
Right.
that may have been like maybe modified in many ways. So do you think we can still do excavation around that and do a study on that archaeologically?
Yes, possible.
Okay.
Possible. I mean, it's possible if we make a detailed, survey of the area, look for traces of some fragments of pottery sherds or tool fragments, whatever. Whatever are the vestiges of those remains, I think there is scope. There is scope for us to look for traces of human settlements.
Okay.
But if they have been living there for just a brief period,
Right.
I don't know how much of that will remain. Yes.
No, that's interesting.
Otherwise, yes, we
Okay.
can.
Okay.
We can do that.
Wow.
Yes.
As I look, as I scroll through your, work history or projects that you have done, one really interesting thing that, the burial site at Jotsoma Nagaland University, the burial site, you said it's an excavation of megalithic, which means prehistoric, right? Or how do you define that?
No, megalithic is just a definition given.
Okay.
So it could be of quite recent period,
Okay.
and it could also be very old.
Okay. So since you have done a lot of megalithic excavation on many Naga areas, as I see, I mean, how do you like to define how old are they? And, those sites are real. Those sites are not just from any oral stories. Those seems to be very real even until today. And then when you did that excavation and studies, I mean, I just want to know, what did you find and what is the takeaways that we can really have?
Well, for a site like Jotsoma,
Yeah.
this was a site which was reported just accidentally. So this was way back in 1998, while I was since I did my BSc in anthropology from Kohima Science College. So I was very, aware of the village areas. I just took a walk down the village area with my friend. And I realized that the people down there were digging some house foundation. And when we inquired, and also around that area, there were a lot of elders gathering and murmuring things. So I asked my friend, he's from the village. So I asked him, what are they saying? Then he said that they have uncovered some human burials. So I was really excited. I said, okay, let's go and have a look. So we went and had a look, and we realized that there are a lot of bones sticking out from the sections of the house foundation. And we asked them, what are you going to do with this? And they said, we'll just throw it away. Then I told him, okay, in that case, if you're going to simply throw it away and discard it, why don't we excavate it? Right? I know there are a lot of ethical issues dealing with human remains, but if they're simply going to discard it, throw it away, we thought that maybe it's also a good opportunity for the department. By then I was already in the department to salvage whatever I can. And so, yes, so right after that we approached the vice chancellor of the university, and he took a lot of interest. And there was one Assamese professor, a visiting professor by the name Professor Jain Fukan. He was from the ancient history background, Northeast Indian history. But he really pushed me. He really encouraged me. And he said that the department should undertake an excavation here. So we approached the vice chancellor, and we could gather some funds. We could request for some funding. And me with my colleague Dam or Vasa, Dr. Vasa and our batch of students, we excavated the site. And what was really interesting in this excavation was apart from the graves, there was a jar burial.
Okay.
There was a jar burial. With a jar, yes,
right.
an earthen jar with human remains in it.
Another human remains in the jar.
Yes.
Wow.
And this got our attention, and we realized that jar burial wasn't a tradition associated with the Angamis.
Achha.
And this was something very remarkable find. So when we asked the village elder, this is how this traditional knowledge is really important also in archaeological research. So we asked the village elder, what does this mean? Because this is quite unique. You don't have jar burial among Angamis. And he said that this kind of burial is meant for only the beloved son in the family. So the beloved son is normally the youngest son.
I see.
In an Angami family.
Okay.
So that was something. And this, this really triggered my interest to work on the Angami mortuary practice for my PhD.
Okay.
So although I am a now,
Yeah.
my interest was towards Angami mortuary practice.
I see.
To see how mortuary practice as also a theoretical framework.
But how do you define that mortuary practice?
Burial practice.
Burial practice.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Burial practice. As a framework to understand inequalities in human societies.
Okay.
Right? And there were a lot of discussions, and it still is, on how we can understand, how archaeologists can understand by looking at burial practice. Right? And as I went on to do my PhD and we did a lot of field work, what really was surprisingly revealed was most Angami villages had this tradition of exposing the dead. So all the while I was thinking that this idea of exposing the dead was only among the Naga groups of the eastern side,
Okay.
the Aus and so on.
I do not get what does it mean by exposing the dead.
It's like you make a machang
Okay.
and you expose the dead
Oh.
and you let it remain there.
Okay. Before burial.
Yes, before burial, but in this case, you just simply expose in a machang,
Okay.
in a scaffold,
Right.
in a raised platform,
Right.
and you leave it there outside of the village.
Okay.
You leave it there,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
And this practice was not known among Angami elders in many of the villages.
Okay.
Only in some few villages, what was revealed was that they did have this practice of exposing the dead, but they stopped this burial practice and they started burying the dead.
Actually burying it
Yes.
inside the earth, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So this burial of the dead was also a pre-colonial thing, a pre-colonial tradition among the Angamis.
Okay.
It was not after Christianity that they started burying the dead.
I'm sure.
Yes. So that was really interesting. That was really interesting. And when I pondered on why they stopped exposing the dead, they said that it was because of this, the whole village, when they go and work in the field, they would see their loved ones being exposed. And they would not be working, they would be weeping and crying the whole day, right? And then I realized that even human emotions can be used as a very important factor to understand this shift in the burial practice. So it did contribute
That's interesting.
to this theoretical framework
Right.
of how we can also view burial practice and the changes in the burial practice, not as a result of some external factors, but internal factors,
Internal factors.
like human emotions.
Correct.
Like human
I
emotions.
think that's a huge
Yeah.
shift from exposing the dead. And
Yes.
they would not be buried at all.
Right.
Those, I mean, as long as they practice that.
Right.
So I think it is the point is human emotions transformed the whole thing and brought that paradigm shift from exposing and to the actual burial.
Right.
So it's a very interesting observation
Yeah.
that human emotions.
I really enjoyed that discussion with the village elders. They were also quite surprised to see an Ao guy traveling along all these Angami and Chagasang villages, narrating rituals of the dead and how the dead is being treated.
Yeah.
So,
How guy lecturing them.
Yes.
That's how you guys used to do.
so it was a great experience for me.
Right,
and
right.
that led me into really understanding the value of traditional knowledge.
Right. Very
Yes.
true. I think I've heard some oral stories about like the exposing the dead. I don't know which tribe or which community practiced that, but I heard somewhere from elders that there are a group of people who used to do that. And they would build fire underneath so that their body will remain smoked and,
Right.
So those, maybe they were referring to that, maybe. That kind of practice.
You mean among Angamis?
Not
or?
necessarily Angams, I do not know which, but those are the similar practices
Yes,
that
yes.
I was told, maybe.
No, the other groups also have their own
Yeah.
practice. There's this mortuary village known as Laruri.
Okay.
So out there, they would use fire to smoke the dead. They would leave the dead in a machang like the Angamis. But here in this case, they would make the machang on one corner of their kitchen,
Acha. Okay.
and they would make a wall, temporary wall, and they would light a fire. And this lighting of the fire goes for several months. And then they would gather the bones. So once the body, the corpse is all dried up, the family members will gather all the bones and they would place them in the jar.
Okay.
And they would leave this jar along with the human remains in their granaries. So that is also the case.
Well, we used
Right.
to do a lot of fascinating things in the past.
Yes.
I do not know
Yeah.
if we would like to go back there, but it's very fascinating.
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, for someone like us in the present, we may think that, keeping the dead, just in front of the kitchen or by the side of the kitchen is something dreadful or unhygienic.
Correct.
But back in the day, I think they had this idea, and the elders also narrates this account that you should not feel that when the dead is exposed by your side, that is something unclean or dirty. Because of so much love that you have for that individual,
Right.
all that is just lost.
Correct. Wow. I think this whole practice automatically or maybe drastically changed with the coming of Christianity because our
Right.
beliefs totally transformed and becomes totally different beliefs.
Yes.
Right. So
Yeah.
maybe Christianity also comes into the picture again here.
Yes. Right. Right.
And now I think, I also want to understand when you trace all of these practices of the past among different tribes, how do you build the idea of a Naga? Like, is there common practices among all these tribal? Because the idea of Naga is very recent.
Yes. And that's a very interesting question. And it's also debated.
Yeah.
It's also debated among scholars, Naga scholars, and also scholars from the outside. It's often debated of this Naga identity, whether it's conceived as a common collective identity or, with so many tribes that you have, with so many diversities that you have, where is this notion or this idea of Naga identity? But when we look into the archaeology, it's still not very clear. I mean, I say this because of the extent of data that we have.
Yeah.
So it's still not very clear how similar are we, right? Because our approach as of now is we are just visiting site to site, excavating, and just building up regional chronologies. How old is this? How old is that? Right? And so it's still not very clear of how we can, from archaeology, look at Naga identity. But what seems to be this is a really tantalizing clue that we have is from ancient DNA. From ancient DNA.
Okay.
And from one of our cave site and rock shelter site, we have been able to excavate some human remains. And these human remains, they go back to about 2800 BC. 2800.
In the Naga area, right?
Yes, Naga area.
Okay.
Naga area. But we are not very sure whether these populations were Naga populations or not.
Right.
But what the ancient DNA, we're working on that. We're still undertaking some further scientific analysis on that. But what the ancient DNA reveals is a possibility of these individuals falling under the Tibeto-Burman language group, which we Nagas also fall within that, right? Yeah. So it's very... I also wouldn't be surprised. If these people are, genetically related to the modern Nagas, right? Because we have our own folklore of our ancestors, emerging from caves, from rock shelters. And these folklore seems to be situated very much within the area of the Naga Hills. It's not somewhere in China or in Mongolia or in the Philippines, right? Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised even if the genetic studies reveals that this might be very similar with the modern Nagas. Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, then, chalo, TK, like we don't know which group of people they actually belong to. But actually we can accept that there are similarities when it comes to like the DNA testing is still ongoing and still it's not ascertained yet.
Yes.
But I think, like you said, we won't be surprised if the DNA remains is the same as of us.
Yes.
So that's something, I would personally be eagerly waiting to see what the DNA test will say. Right. That'll be very interesting. Yes. So we'll look forward to that. But now if you have done a lot of excavations and you have found a lot of, tools and human implements and a lot of things used by human beings those days. Now, when you look at it, how would you like to paint the picture of Naga lifestyle those days? Maybe 100 years back, 200 years back, 300 years back. How can we visualize that? If we were to paint a picture of the Naga lifestyle in the past, is it the same as of now or? From the little data that you have.
Not now, but maybe until colonial times.
Yeah.
I think we were building stone monuments. We were offering the feast of merit.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And our social structures also were different from tribe to tribe. Group to group, cultural group.
True.
Because this tribe is a colonial connotation, cultural group to group. So and we were engaged in pottery making, we were engaged in blacksmithing, and a few of the Naga groups were also engaged in iron smelting. There's a scholar of mine, a PhD scholar of mine, who has done his research on Naga metallurgy, and his work suggests that there are strong indications of Nagas knowing the knowledge of iron smelting.
Wow.
So having knowledge of forging a metal and having knowledge of smelting is different. Right?
Okay.
So Nagas, a few Nagas like the Kamlingan group and the Konya group. He has worked in these areas. So he's of the strong opinion that they did have knowledge of iron smelting. And he has also excavated one of the site somewhere around Tizit area, where he has found some very rudimentary traces of a smelting kiln, a kiln where you heat up the iron ore and you smelt it. That's how you extract the iron. So we were engaged in that, and we were engaged in pottery making, and we were also engaged in, I wouldn't say long distance trading, but at least up to the borders of Assam and up to Myanmar. Around that border, I think we were engaged in trading networks on beads, on cowrie shells, on corn shells. Yes. And I think this activity has continued until the colonial period. And Christianity came and, our lifestyles changed and so on.
Well, it's very interesting to learn the practice of iron smelting and having the knowledge of iron, even, past in those days. But I think there is no certainty as of now that it was the same kind of group of people that we are. The same kind of group of people, the Naga tribal, the modern Naga tribal. So is there any surety or certainty that they are the people who were the same as the Nagas today? Because it will be, I think, if it were the Nagas, it will be like quite advanced in their days to have this knowledge of smelting iron.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, we were not savages. We being called as savage were this colonial
construct, right?
Construct, yes. Otherwise, we were not savages. We were quite intelligent in the way that we observed the world around us. We exploited resources, right? And how we interacted with our social, biophysical environment. So, I can be quite sure that these traces of smelting activities are the Nagas. And these are certain groups of Nagas, not the whole Nagas. But especially with regards to the village of Wi, they still are into blacksmithing, metal forging, and they have an oral tradition that says that their ancestors actually extracted ore from a particular location. It's a little above the village, from that particular location, and they smelted them, right? And this student of mine has done some experimental studies. So since we does not have any longer this practice of extracting the ore from its natural source and smelting them, he did some experiments and he made this makeshift kiln, the furnace, where he heated those iron ore. And this were all based on oral accounts that he was able to demonstrate. And the experiment did show, potential of the argument that Nagas were also into iron smelting and not only blacksmithing. So this was one, and the other excavation which he had was in the Mon district area, and he has dated that site. He has dated that site to, I think it was around 15th century AD. 15th century AD. And in and around that area, he has also reported a lot of iron smelting slags.
I see.
Right. And this the site of was dated. We have two radiocarbon dates. One goes back very early. Surprisingly very early, around 800 BC. And this seems to be like the earliest Naga ancestral site so far that we have on record. And the other site, the other location from the same site goes back to about the 7th century AD.
So,
So it's very likely that, that was the earliest. That particular location was the earliest, and the other location on the other end of the village was a later occupation.
oh,
Yes. So
Sir.
so it is interesting. Yes.
those are interesting.
Yes.
Because what we know is like just 100 years back, Nagas were like the headhunting days, and our history generally seems to start from those headhunting days, and it does
Right.
not really go back further, until you share all of this information, and until archaeological intervention came into the picture. So this is already, something that is really fascinating as a Naga, as a tribal group. That, just the iron, not just the iron smelting, we can see earthen pottery. This kind of, let's say, production of those tools and uses that we always have, even until today. Up until today, we all still have that. It's just that we lost the sense of
Right.
iron smelting and
Right.
extracting iron ore and so on. I think no one knows where it got lost. But anyway, leaving that aside, I would also like to understand your experience of excavating the caves, the for shelter caves, and
Right.
you have done a lot of that excavations. I want to understand, what do we see from those findings?
Yeah, this idea of investigating caves came from this global, debate on looking at Northeast as a corridor of human migration, right? And there are a lot of debates, ongoing debates. Some say that it was a barrier for human migration because of the high mountains, the high upland areas. Whereas some geneticists say that this was also a corridor of human migration. And we wanted to investigate further into this and see in which framework of this debate can we fit into, right? So we undertook this survey, and the first survey into these caves were back in 2009. This is quite early. And I think we were one of the first team in the Northeast to be surveying and excavating cave sites. Like I said, the site of Kankui was surveyed and excavated in the 1960s by a Meitei archaeologist known as O.K. Singh.
I see.
So ever since his work, I missed out the name of a pioneering Naga archaeologist who now resides in the US. His name is Vikosa Nenu.
Okay.
So he took some small scale excavation.
And that Kankui?
No,
Oh, no.
In and around the Mimi village.
Mimi village.
Yes, you have a lot of limestone caves there.
That's in Noklak or
That's in Pungro area.
Pungro area? Probably Gifri then.
Yes,
Yeah,
Gifri.
yeah. Okay,
Gifri.
Gifri,
Yes,
right.
Gifri. And so he undertook some small scale excavation in one of the cave that we re-excavated again. And so we wanted to see if we are actually able to reveal traces of human habitation in those cave sites, right? And so one of the cave that we visited, that we surveyed, was this cave known as Ranyakan.
Okay.
Ranyakan. These days a lot of YouTubers go there and, they visit the cave. But this was quite early on, 2009. So we went there, we camped there. And if you see the setting of the cave also, it has very high ceiling. It's about 9 meters, roughly 9 meters.
That's
or
very
higher.
high. Yeah, very
Yes,
high.
very high. And it has good sunlight, at least the sunset.
Yes.
Sunset, it has very good sunlight. And also it's very closely located near a stream, right? So when we look for cave sites, these are some of the primary factors that we look into. the ecological factors, right? So we went there, we camped there, and we excavated the site. And surprisingly, we were not expecting such an early date for this particular site.
Wow.
And surprisingly, it turned out to be around 4,500 BC. 4,500, and we were stunned by the dating.
Correct.
And what we also unearthed was a human burial. A human burial. So I was really hoping that there would be some traces of DNA on this human burial, but sadly, we were not able to extract DNA from this particular individual.
I see.
Because they said, the specialist, the scientist said that it's all deteriorated, maybe due to environmental factors. But the DNA for the other site, we do have that, but not for this particular site.
Okay.
So these people were mobile hunter-gatherers. Mobile means they were going from one cave to another, moving. So they were hunter-gatherers. They were using pots. And if you look at the design of the pot, they were mainly court-mark pot. Court-mark pots are design that you incorporate when you're making the pot. You wrap it around some threads on a stick, and you beat it, and it gives the impression of those threads, right? Those wounded threads.
Right.
And the use of court-mark potteries goes back quite surprisingly again. It goes back quite early on to about 4,500 BC. In the region. This is also one significant observation that we have been able to make, that this tradition of court-mark potteries went very early on at around 4,500 BC. And from the other side that we also excavated, which is of a later period, around 2,800 BC, we do have there also. So these people were using court-mark potteries, and they were also using stone tools. They were making stone tools from the river pebbles. Since you have a stream close by, they were perhaps going down the stream, collecting these river pebbles, and they were sharpening on the edge. This technique, we call this as the edge ground method.
I see.
Right? So these were very small groups, very mobile groups, and they were hunting a lot of wild animals.
For sure.
We did not encounter any traces of agriculture. So it's very likely that they were foraging instead of farming.
Right.
And they were hunting a lot of wild animals like deer, stags. You also have snakes. Because the archaeologist who is in our team has been able to, uncover some evidence of snakes. They were catching frogs, snails, very much
just like the modern
diet that we have now.
Wow.
Even the Nagas have, right? So we have this particular site, and we also have, not very far from Mimi, this is just below the village of Mimi.
Okay.
Not very far from the village of Mimi, we have this village known as Hakumute. This is the last village, and thereafter you have the Indo-Myanmar international border, which is around 5 hours trekking distance from there. And around half an hour walk from this Hakumute village is also another cave. And this cave, what is interesting about this cave is, from this cave we have the entrance of the cave, which was dated to about, very similar with the date from that previous cave, about 4,700 BC. But the interior of the cave revealed a date of about 16,000
years ago.
16,000.
Wow.
This was really stunning.
Right.
16,000. So 4,500 way early on. 16,000.
That's crazy.
But what is really interesting about this 16,000 layer, because archaeologists, we excavate in earth layers.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
first layer, the second layer, the third layer. So this is coming from the bottom layer. So the bottom layer, 16,000 BP, with just a huge spread of ash, there's nothing. Just a huge spread of ash with no bones, no tools, no pottery fragments, nothing. Just the ash. So when we presented this data in international conferences, people were skeptical. They said maybe it's a forest fire, that started somewhere on the entrance of the cave and entered the interiors of the cave. But our argument is that we started our excavation from the entrance of the cave and slowly went towards the interiors, right? And if there was a forest fire, a natural forest fire that started around the entrance of the cave, there would have been a trail of ash, which we did not see, right? So it is very, very likely that some humans were living there.
Okay.
Some humans were living there as early as 16,000 BP. And beyond that site, we have what is a rock shelter site where we also have traces of human remains. And in a cluster of a burial, we have human remains without heads. Those were headless. And surprisingly, we could extract some ancient DNA from few of those individuals, which is now under study currently. So these people were also making pots. They were also using edge ground tools.
Achha.
And they were into body ornamentation. We got a lot of bone beads that they were using. So it goes back right from 16,000 BP to as recent as 2,800, 1,800 BC.
What's the difference between BP and BC?
BP is in terms of thousands of years.
Right.
And BC is, you would also have a date with BP, but we use a software to convert that into BC.
Okay.
So the thing is, the significant observation that we can make here is, who are these people?
Right. That's something.
Who are these people, right?
Right.
Where they are Naga ancestors who are living a hunting gathering way of life and then gradually moved on to live in villages. And you have social complexity in the Naga hills with the rise of villages and the spread of villages. That is one area that we're yet to investigate.
Correct. But by looking at the way they practice, in terms of headless means like, can it be something like a headhunting, part of the headhunting days? That's one thing.
Yes, I'm glad that you asked that because that is normally the, first instance that gets the attention when we present this data in conferences. They say that is this an early, antiquity or trace of the headhunting practice that you all have? But it's not very clear. It's not very clear because the headless may be as a result of some ritualistic practice. Like, for instance, Konyaks also have this practice of removing the skull and depositing the skull in some kind of a box.
Achha.
And the rest of the human remains are just left, but on a machang. They're not buried. Changs also have this practice of just removing the skull. So we're not very sure whether it's an actual case of headhunting rituals or it is a part of their burial practice, is not very sure. But in one of the burial, this was a female. So just by the side of the female, there was a small infant.
Achha. You could find all of that.
Not entirely, but
No.
at least the cranium.
Yes.
So the cranium of the infant was intact. It was intact.
Wow.
So this leads us to raise so many questions, whether, if it is a case of headhunting,
Right.
why was the skull of the infant not retrieved, right? So there were a lot of questions that we had, and our interpretation of the assemblage, that burial evidence that we have, would be aligning more towards this ritualistic practice of removing the head of the deceased as a part of a burial ritual, not actually a case of head hunting, because the bioarchaeologists who looked into the vertebrae of the spine of the vertebral column did not notice any cut marks or marks which were left by some sharp objects.
Okay.
So it's very doubtful.
Right.
Very, very doubtful.
Right.
Yes.
But now seeing all this, listening to you, like dating back to 16,000 BP and 4,500 BC, the remains of people in the Naga areas in the cave. Those are very fascinating already. But my only question now is how accurate all of this carbon dating is. Is it reliable? Does it really say the exact years? Exact as in, is it accurately or reliably say the span of years? Or
yes, it is. It is reliable. And one thing which is, good about radiocarbon dating is that it does not say that this artifact was made in, let's say, 15th century AD.
Okay.
But it says, it gives you a bracket. From this to this is very likely. So it gives you a long time bracket of maybe a difference of 250 years, 100 years, or even 50 years, even 30 years.
Okay. Right. In a very broad bracket.
Yes.
Now, suppose war cemetery is here. If we excavate that, will it say that it's almost 100 years old? Or will it be too short a time span that carbon dating will not work properly?
It'll give you the age of only when the death of that individual took place, the incident of death.
Okay.
Because human bodies or any living organisms, we intake, one is normal carbon and the other one is radioactive carbon. So when that living organism dies, the radioactive carbon gradually decays. It gradually decays.
Okay.
And scientists estimate how much of that radiocarbon is left in that living organism.
Okay.
Yes. So there's that methodological principle regarding radiocarbon. Yes.
Okay. But there is some empiricism in that, right? There is some accuracy in that.
Yes.
Because as someone who doesn't practice that.
Yeah. There is. But it's safe because the radiocarbon dates are giving a broad range.
Right.
So they're not saying that, it's 1200 BC.
Correct.
But we can say it's about 1200 BC.
But if we take the lowest of it, then it's certain for sure, minimum at least.
Within this range to that range.
Right.
Yes.
If it is, for example, like 2000 to 2500 BC, then at least 2000 is correct.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. You can fall somewhere in the middle.
Right.
Or you can fall somewhere in the earlier period or the later period.
Later period.
Yes.
But it won't fall beyond it. It won't fall below that.
Yes. So when I say the date for this cave site, 4500 BC, that is a rough estimate.
Correct.
So if you want to scroll through the dates, it will be maybe 4450 BC to 4600 BC. Somewhere around that range.
Wow, this is already very, very fascinating. And I'm sure, people who do all these kinds of works will have a sleep. Will not like to sleep, until they find out something. And when they actually excavate and find some remains, I think it will be just you'll be so passionate about it, you'll forget like your lunch, your dinner, and
yes. And I think luck also matters. Luck also matters in these archaeological expeditions.
For sure.
Yes.
But now you say the luck matters. Now, when you visit the cave, how did you decide we'll start digging from here, excavating from here? Sometimes you may dig tons of mountains, but you may not.
That's a very interesting question.
Right.
Yes. in our case, what we do is we take very small pits, just about, let's say about 15 centimeter in diameter. These are circular ones.
Correct.
And we dig them in a row in terms of intervals.
Okay.
Right? This is not to greatly disturb the site, to see whether we have traces of, some human activities. And once we are able to locate maybe some fragments of animal bones or pottery fragments or tool fragments, then we know, okay, this is something. Something is there underneath. Because we don't use sophisticated machines like a metal detector, because we're dealing with sites where knowledge of metals were never known.
Correct.
Around 4,500 BC.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Right.
I think having all this knowledge and having this data now, I think it will not just be there as a data. It can even unify or integrate the idea of being a Naga, being a one group of people. Once we ascertain the DNA test, and if it finds similar to all of us, the modern Naga people,
Right.
I think it will help in any sort of social, cultural, and in many aspects. I will feel.
Yeah. Right. But in my opinion, just to be really objective,
Right.
The diversity that we observe now, it's quite obvious. I mean, ours, okay, we say that the tribal connotation is, a colonial construct, whatever,
Yep,
right?
yep.
But we also observe diversities around us. And we also have to accept the fact that it is also important to also embrace these diversities. So when we think of a common collective Naga identity, in terms of, constructing this idea of nation states or whatever,
Right.
it's not also necessary to always think in terms of similarities.
I agree. I
Right?
agree.
Because nation states
Yeah.
are also very, very diverse. So I don't see any harm even if we say that we are also different in many respects, right? So be it as it may, whether the archaeological evidence supports this idea of Naga identity, common identity, I would rather be, happy with seeing the diversities. Right.
Absolutely. That's one interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Because I think in many ways, in our general public discourse, there's a saying like Naga by blood. There's nothing as such.
Right. Right.
There's no, honestly, it's just a cultural, maybe let's say cultural commonness rather than factual or biological commonness.
Yes.
Or I would not know how to actually define this at this moment.
Sorry.
I would not actually know how to define it. It could be more of a cultural commonness, cultural similarities.
Yes.
Rather than physical or maybe, biological similarities. We have, like you said, a lot of diversities for sure.
We may look Asian, but
Right.
does not mean that because we look Asian, we have similar stories or similar histories.
Absolutely.
Right?
For that matter, every village has different stories too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think in this quest for progress and unity as this notion of Naga nation, I think it's also important for us to embrace this diversity.
Absolutely. Equally important.
And inclusivity.
Yeah.
I think this is really important for us now
Wow.
at this very critical juncture. Yes.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You have been doing all these works. I think, it will, having someone like you who has that experience of digging the past, it's a treasure especially for people like us who don't have much documentation. And I don't think the Britishers would come and do it for us. I think unless we do it for ourselves, they would not have come and studied like how you have studied the Angami burial or Chakasang site or the community archaeological works.
Yes, right.
So I think, having someone from our own community, from our own social group doing this, to me, I find it very, very, it's considered as a big contribution to our society.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is something, when time will come when those sites will be deteriorated or greatly disturbed. And I think whatever documents, data that you have found today will still be used as one of the, secondary data to really define something out of it.
Right.
So overall, I have personally learned a lot from your sharing and from this conversation. But I would like to hear your final thought on how would you define you have done the studies on many tribes, and there are different findings, different data that you found, and a lot of diverse data, and hardly there will be any similarities when it comes to that for sure. But how would you like to define the people that you found, the kind of practices that you find, and how do we look forward to the future, and what kind of things that we expect? And there are some DNA tests to be done and can be still pending. So how do you, keeping the life of the people, giving the social group in mind, what would be the best way to really ascertain all of this? And how do we ascertain and get data as much as possible?
Well, to take it from another angle, perspective, this very notion of our origin and migration, I think this needs to be rethought again. And now so much of linguistic research is being initiated now, even among this language group, the Tibeto-Burman and the Austroasiatic speakers. And what is being revealed in this linguistic research, so I'm just coming from the other disciplines. What is being revealed from the linguistic research is that the diversity of the Tibeto-Burman speakers, language, is very, very diverse here. Northeast India, including Nagaland, right? And historical linguist has been trying to understand this. How is this diversity coming about, right? So instead of this narrative of we migrating all the way from China or from Mongolia, this Great Wall of China, or across the seas, the seafaring people, I think this narrative of looking at the reverse narrative of this being the epicenter of our language group, at least may not be the Naga identity per se, but at least our language group of this Tibeto-Burman, maybe this was the epicenter.
Okay.
Because we see a lot of diversity. So it's very likely that the epicenter could be Northeast India. And this language group migrating into other regions of mainland Southeast Asia. Right? And there are some Naga groups who are now migrated in Myanmar. There's a Naga group known as Para Naga. I'm not sure whether you have heard of this name.
I haven't.
Para.
I haven't.
Para.
Okay.
They now live around this Leishi area in Burma.
Okay.
Yes. They have a migration story of they migrating from that Laruri Mimi area. Their ancestors were there and they migrated into Burma. Right? So, is it always the case that we have always migrated from east to west? Or has it also been the reverse, right? From west to east. And I understand this narrative of migration from the east is linked to this Naga identity, saying that we are different, right? But I think it's also important now, with so much of happening in linguistic research and anthropological research, it's also important for us to, why not we look at it from the other direction, right? And see what clues can we gather by looking at, let's say, from west to east on our migration. including the Nagas, right? So this idea of autochthonous, this is an anthropological term.
Okay.
It means indigenous. This idea of we being indigenous, I think is also rooted in the land. And how long have we been living here, right? And if we look into the ancient DNA study, the experts are saying that they're not exactly able to pinpoint whether these were Naga groups or not for now, but at least they're saying that these were the ancestral Tibeto-Burmans, right? So it does give us a clue to see these groups speaking this particular language, living in these parts of the region for a very, very long time, right? And me being an indigenous archaeologist, when we approach our oral tradition, our folklore, and so on and so forth, and offering a scientific basis, it does not mean that I am having a very, very scientific approach or an understanding to our history, because our folklore is also equally important, right? So it is not to say, even if we are able to offer the scientific evidence or the empirical evidence on our Naga migration or on our Naga history, it is not to say that these understanding of our, migration, the folklore, the migration associated, the folklore associated with human migrations are least important.
Yeah.
It's not to say that, right? But what we can do is that we can incorporate the indigenous views of their heritage and their past. And also at the same time, we can incorporate the scientific views and see how they corroborate, right? And at times they may meet together and at times they may not meet, but doesn't matter, right?
Correct.
So I think me as an indigenous archaeologist working on our own heritage, I think it is important for us to make that stand and not, make somebody else think that he comes from a training of a very Eurocentric, mindset and approach, and is looking into our indigenous history and does not know anything about it, right? So I think it's a balanced way of incorporating both the indigenous views of the past,
absolutely,
and also modern science into one.
Yep. Right. Without either of them,
Right.
It can create problem in our understanding of the actual,
Yes.
tradition and practice of the people.
Right.
So both are necessary. I would totally agree.
Yes.
Both are actually very, very necessary.
Yeah.
And both gives us a lighthouse signal towards, meeting the other in many ways. Like you say,
Right.
Jungdi Imli, where you trace through the help of the oral stories and when you actually found one.
Right.
I think this is going to be very helpful for students as well as for researchers and for the general population as a whole, to create this awareness that, we could be as old as 4,500 years old people. Yeah. So I think maybe...
And I'm not surprised.
We'll not be surprised.
Okay, that's good.
It's there.
Yeah. And even if not, then that's also fine.
There's nothing to worry about it.
Yeah.
So I wish you all the best. This has been very, very fascinating.
Thank you very much.
I have not heard so much about, this kind of knowledge from anywhere yet, because I've not talked to archaeologists in my life so far. And especially with our own people. We have heard a lot about how pyramids were made and how Taj Mahal. Those are fine. Let them exist. But our own people, who are we? And where did we come from? This is a big question for all of us. And you have really shed important lights on this. And this really gives us a sense and a premise information that, okay, we could be this, we could be this, we could be this. So it really entertains our intellect in many ways as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you
so much. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge.
I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thank you. Same here. Same here. Wonderful moment we had.
Thank you.
We'll talk again maybe in the future.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor.
Sure. Thank you.